He said, "I'm not sure that's my child." 3 years later, he saw two little girls with his blue eyes, and realized the truth he'd thrown away. Aaron Blake built his world out of precision, control, and logic. Every decision he made was measured, calculated, and justified by numbers. He was the kind of man who believed emotions were weaknesses, distractions that clouded judgment. To everyone around him, he was the perfect image of success, the powerful CEO who had turned a failing company into a billion-dollar empire, the man whose words could move markets and whose cold blue eyes never revealed doubt. Yet behind that carefully crafted facade was a man who had long forgotten what warmth felt like. His life was efficient but empty, his penthouse spotless but silent. Everything in Aaron's world existed to serve a purpose, until Sophia walked into it. Sophia had come to his company 3 years earlier as a consultant for a charity project. She was nothing like the people he usually surrounded himself with. Where they spoke in numbers and strategy, she spoke in ideas and empathy. Her brown eyes seemed to hold entire worlds, and her calm voice carried conviction that could not be ignored. Aaron had been drawn to her despite himself. She saw through him in ways that made him uncomfortable, and in that discomfort, he found something almost addictive. What began as late-night discussions about the project turned into dinners, then weekends together that neither of them planned but both secretly wanted. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quantify. When Sophia told him she was pregnant, it was as if someone had ripped the floor from beneath him. He had always lived by rules: control everything, depend on no one, and never let emotion dictate your choices. Yet now, faced with the possibility of a child, all of that control turned to fear. She stood before him in his office that evening, her voice steady but her eyes full of quiet hope. "Aaron," she said softly, "I wanted you to hear it from me first. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt endless. His mind raced through implications: his reputation, the board, the shareholders, the press. In his world, scandal was unforgivable. He didn't see the woman who loved him standing there, only the potential threat she represented to the order of his life. "I'm not sure that's my child," he said finally, his voice low and sharp. The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and yet even as he said them, he felt something inside him fracture. Sophia stared at him as though she didn't recognize the man in front of her. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You know I wouldn't lie to you." He looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze, unwilling to see the pain he had caused. "I can't do this," he said simply. "Not now." She waited a moment, searching his face for even a flicker of emotion, but there was nothing. Then she nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "You've made your choice." That night, she left without another word. The apartment that had once been filled with laughter and half-finished conversations fell silent again. Aaron poured himself a drink, trying to push down the heaviness pressing against his chest. He told himself it was better this way, that she would be fine, that it wasn't his responsibility. Yet as he stood by the window overlooking the city, something deep inside him whispered that he had just destroyed the only real thing he had ever known. Weeks turned into months, and Aaron tried to bury himself in work. He told no one about Sophia, pretending she had never existed. But every now and then, when the office emptied and he was alone in his glass tower, he would find himself remembering her laugh, the way she used to look at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, the warmth of her presence that had once made his world feel alive. He told himself it was just nostalgia, that it would fade, but it didn't. It became a quiet ache he carried everywhere, a reminder of the one decision he could never undo. Meanwhile, miles away, Sophia was living a completely different reality. She moved to a small coastal town where no one knew her name. There, she gave birth to twin girls with dark hair and striking blue eyes, eyes that made her heart ache every time they looked up at her. The resemblance was undeniable. She tried not to think about him, tried not to imagine the life they could have had. Instead, she focused on survival, working long hours at a local cafe, sewing at night to earn extra money. There were nights she sat by the window, holding one sleeping daughter in her arms while the other lay beside her, and she whispered stories about strength and forgiveness to keep herself from breaking. For all his success, Aaron's life began to feel smaller. The people who once flattered him now irritated him. The parties, the contracts, the luxury, all of it felt hollow. One evening, he attended a charity gala, the kind of event he used to thrive at, surrounded by people pretending to care about causes they barely understood. A woman laughed nearby, her voice light and warm, and for a moment, he thought he heard Sophia. The sound hit him so hard he had to step outside. Standing under the city lights, he realized that no matter how far he climbed, he was still haunted by the ghost of the woman he had driven away. He told himself he didn't believe in fate, but sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of a life that might have been: two little girls running on a beach, Sophia smiling in the distance, sunlight catching her hair. He shook the vision away each time, convincing himself it was nothing but imagination. He didn't know that somewhere, miles away, those visions were real. He didn't know that the faces he saw in dreams would one day look up at him with the same eyes he saw in the mirror. By the end of that third year, the man who once claimed certainty in everything found himself unable to sleep, unable to silence the question that had begun to echo inside him: what if I was wrong? 3 years had passed since that night, and the distance between Aaron Blake and the man he had once been grew harder to define. On paper, he was more successful than ever. His company dominated the market, his name appeared in every major financial publication, and investors spoke of him with a kind of reverence that bordered on fear. Yet none of it felt like victory. He woke each morning in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home, surrounded by glass, steel, and silence. The walls were covered with art he didn't care about, the view a perfect panorama of a city that no longer impressed him. People called him disciplined, focused, even brilliant, but in truth he was haunted. Every achievement felt like an echo against a hollow core, and no matter how much money he made, nothing quieted the faint, persistent ache that followed him everywhere. He had learned to live with regret the way some people live with a chronic wound: it hurt less over time, but it never really healed. Sometimes, in the rare hours between midnight and dawn, he would find himself staring at the ceiling, wondering where she was, what had become of her. He had tried to find Sophia once, months after she left, but she had vanished completely. No social media, no records, no trace of her name. His lawyers suggested she might have left the country, but he doubted it. He had the money to search, but something inside him told him he didn't deserve to know. He had told himself that his disbelief was logical, that he had done what any practical man would do, but even logic has its limits when guilt begins to rot from the inside. Meanwhile, Sophia's world was one of quiet struggle and gentle resilience. The small coastal town she had chosen was both her refuge and her prison. The ocean became her confidant, its endless rhythm reminded her that life, no matter how broken, always moved forward. The cafe she worked at was modest, painted in faded blue, with white curtains that fluttered in the wind. Most days began before sunrise. She would dress the twins, Emma and Bella, in matching sweaters, braid their dark hair, and walk them down to the daycare by the harbor. Then she would hurry to the cafe, where she spent her days serving tourists and locals with the same patient smile. The regulars adored her, though none knew her story. They only knew she was kind, hard-working, and that her daughter's laughter could light up the whole street. The twins were growing fast, talking in long, curious sentences, their blue eyes wide with wonder. They often asked about their father. "Where is he, Mama?" Emma would ask, pressing her cheek to Sophia's arm. Sophia would hesitate, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "He lives far away," she would say softly, her heart tightening with every word. "He doesn't know about us." Bella, the quieter of the two, would nod solemnly and ask, "Will he ever come?" Sophia never had an answer for that. Some nights, after they had fallen asleep, she sat by the window, watching the reflection of the moon in the sea and whispering, "I hope not." And I hope he does. Aaron's life, in contrast, had become a cycle of endless meetings and empty victories. He no longer celebrated deals, he simply signed papers, accepted handshakes, and returned home to silence. His assistant noticed how distracted he had become, how he often stared out the window instead of at his computer screen, how he asked strange questions during lunch meetings. Once, during a board dinner, one of his partners joked about family being a distraction. The room laughed. Aaron didn't. The next day, he canceled all his weekend appointments and drove aimlessly for hours outside the city. He stopped at a gas station somewhere near the coast and watched the waves through the windshield, unable to explain to himself why his chest felt so tight. Fate, it seemed, had begun to stir. A few weeks later, a new resort project came across his desk. The location was a small town by the ocean, a prime spot for development, full of potential. His team was eager, the numbers looked perfect. Normally, Aaron would have delegated the site inspection, but something about this project tugged at him. He told his staff he wanted to see it personally, a rare decision that surprised even him. He arrived on a bright, windy afternoon, the smell of salt and fresh bread in the air. The construction site overlooked the bay, and just down the hill, nestled among old wooden houses, was a small cafe painted in faded blue. From where he stood, he could see white curtains moving in the breeze, and for reasons he couldn't name, he felt drawn to it. He told his driver to wait and walked down the narrow street. The cafe bell rang as he entered, and the familiar scent of coffee and baked pastries filled the air. A woman's laughter drifted from behind the counter, light and genuine, and when she stepped forward, time stopped. It was her. Sophia. Her hair was tied back, her eyes warm but tired, her movements graceful in a way that made his chest tighten. For a moment, he thought he might be imagining it. 3 years had changed her, softened her edges, but he would have known her anywhere. She didn't see him right away, she was helping 2 little girls at a nearby table. Aaron's breath caught as he looked closer. The girls were identical, dark hair, blue eyes, small faces lit with the same brightness he used to see in Sophia. One of them laughed, and it was like hearing a sound he had dreamed of without knowing it. His hands trembled. He felt the air leave his lungs. It was as if every decision he had made, every wall he had built, had led him to this exact moment. He stepped back, gripping the doorframe, afraid to be seen. The truth hit him with the weight of something both miraculous and cruel. Those girls were his. There was no doubt, no question, no logic left to hide behind. He had said once that he wasn't sure the child was his, but now, standing there, looking at his own eyes reflected twice over, he knew he had been wrong in every possible way. He left before she noticed him, stumbling into the sunlight like a man emerging from a long, dark tunnel. The sound of their laughter followed him down the street, echoing in his mind long after he reached the car. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe properly. His driver asked if he was all right, and he simply nodded, unable to form words. That night, back in his hotel, he didn't open his laptop or answer a single call. He sat by the window, staring at the sea, haunted by the sight of 2 little girls with his eyes and her smile. For the first time in years, Aaron Blake, the man who thought he had no weaknesses, felt completely and utterly broken. Aaron didn't sleep that night. The image of the 2 little girls replayed in his mind endlessly, looping like a film he couldn't turn off. He could still hear their laughter, see the way their small hands reached for Sophia, their matching blue eyes glowing with innocence. Every time he blinked, their faces appeared again, his own reflection staring back at him through them. For years, he had tried to convince himself that walking away was the logical choice, that emotions had no place in the life he had built. Now, logic felt meaningless. He had spent so long chasing control, yet one unexpected moment in a small seaside cafe had shattered every illusion of power he thought he had. The next morning, he drove back to the cafe. He told himself he wouldn't go inside, that he only wanted to see them again from a distance. He parked across the street, lowering the window slightly, and watched. Sophia was arranging chairs on the porch, her hair tied loosely, strands blowing in the wind. She looked the same and yet completely different. There was a quiet strength in her now, something unshakable that came from surviving pain without help. The girls played near her feet, chasing each other in small circles, their laughter echoing across the street. Aaron felt his chest tighten with something he didn't recognize at first, longing, guilt, and something even deeper that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He came back again the next day, and the day after that. He stayed in the car, always watching from afar, never daring to approach. At night, he lay awake in his hotel room, replaying the moments he'd seen, trying to imagine what it would be like to walk up to them and say the words he had once refused to believe, that he was their father. But each time he pictured it, fear stopped him. He didn't know how to face Sophia, how to look her in the eyes after the things he'd said. What could he possibly say now that would make any difference? Still, he couldn't stay away. The pull was too strong. On the 5th day, Sophia noticed him. She was leaving the cafe when she caught sight of the familiar car across the street. Her heart stopped for a moment. She knew that car, even after all these years. She stood frozen, disbelief turning to anger, and then to something sharper, resolve. Without hesitation, she crossed the street, her movements calm but purposeful. Aaron saw her coming and felt his pulse quicken. He stepped out of the car, unsure whether to speak first, but the look in her eyes silenced him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but steady. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her gaze hardening. "You don't belong in our lives anymore." Her use of the word "our" hit him like a punch. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Sophia," he started, "I didn't know," she cut him off. "You didn't want to know," she said sharply. "That's the difference." The words stung because they were true. He looked at her, seeing not the woman he'd left behind, but someone who had built an entire world without him. "They're mine," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Aren't they?" Sophia's expression didn't change. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "They're yours. But they're also mine. And I'm the one who stayed." He felt the air leave his lungs. "I just want to see them," he said, desperate now. She shook her head slowly. "You've already seen enough. You had your chance 3 years ago. You made your choice." She turned to walk away, but he reached out instinctively, stopping just short of touching her arm. "Sophia, please," he said. "I didn't know how to." She faced him again, her eyes flashing. "No. You didn't want to know how. You walked away because it was easier. You wanted a clean life without complications, and we didn't fit into that. So don't come back now pretending to care." Her words sliced through him, each one landing with painful precision. He stood there in silence as she turned and walked back to the cafe, her hair catching the light, her daughters running toward her with joy. He watched as she knelt to hug them, their small arms wrapping around her neck. It was a perfect picture of love and belonging, and he realized with crushing clarity that he had never been part of it. That night, he drove to the edge of the coast and sat by the water, the sound of the waves filling the silence he couldn't bear. He had always believed that time erased regret, that success could replace the parts of a person that were too painful to face. But now he saw that time didn't erase anything, it only made the emptiness harder to ignore. He thought of Sophia's face when she said "I stayed," and something inside him cracked open. The next few days, he stayed away from the cafe, trying to convince himself that leaving again was the right thing to do. He told himself that showing up after 3 years could only make things worse. Yet no matter how far he drove, his thoughts circled back to the same place, to those 2 little girls and the woman who had carried the weight of his cowardice. He began to imagine their lives without him. The morning Sophia spent rushing to work, the nights she spent reading to them by lamplight, the countless moments of joy and exhaustion he had denied himself. One evening, unable to fight it any longer, he returned. He waited until the cafe closed, then approached quietly, unsure if he would even be allowed to speak to her. The lights inside were dim, and through the window, he saw Sophia wiping down tables while the girls colored in notebooks. When she looked up and saw him standing there, she didn't speak right away. Her expression was tired, guarded, but not surprised. She walked to the door and opened it, standing in the frame without inviting him in. "Why are you here again?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "Because I can't leave it like this," he said. "I can't walk away this time." Sophia studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the man she used to know. She saw the expensive suit, the perfect posture, but there was something different in his eyes now, something broken. She sighed, her shoulders softening slightly. "You can't just decide to show up and expect everything to change," she said. "You think regret is enough?" "It isn't." He nodded. "I know. But I have to start somewhere." She hesitated, torn between anger and something that felt dangerously close to pity. "You should go," she said quietly. "The girls don't need confusion. They don't need promises that might break them later." He looked down, then back at her. "I'm not here to make promises," he said. "I'm here because I finally see what I destroyed. And I don't know how to fix it, but I'll stay until I learn." For the first time, she didn't immediately turn him away. She stood in silence for a long time before closing the door halfway. "Then start by leaving us alone, for now," she said. "If you mean it, you'll come back when you're ready to prove it." Then she shut the door. Aaron walked back to his car, the night wind cold against his face, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely numb. The ache inside him was unbearable, but it was real, and that meant he was finally beginning to feel again. As he sat in the car, staring at the dim cafe windows, he realized something he had never allowed himself to believe before, that redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about earning the right to try. For several weeks after that night, Aaron stayed away, though the pull toward the little cafe by the sea never weakened. He threw himself back into work, but the numbers and meetings that once consumed him no longer held weight. Everything felt artificial compared to the life he had glimpsed through that window, the laughter, the warmth, the quiet humanity that had nothing to do with contracts or profits. Yet even in his absence, he couldn't stop thinking about Sophia and the girls. The thought of them became both a comfort and a punishment. He began waking earlier than usual, standing by the window of his penthouse with a cup of coffee, staring at the horizon, wondering what they were doing at that exact moment. He didn't recognize himself anymore. The man who once calculated every decision was now living under the rule of his heart, though he barely understood what that meant. Finally, one cold morning, he couldn't bear the distance any longer. He drove back to the coast, rehearsing explanations in his mind, though none seemed enough. When he arrived, the cafe was half empty, the scent of fresh pastries drifting through the open door. He walked in quietly, expecting resistance, maybe even anger, but Sophia only looked up from behind the counter and froze. She didn't tell him to leave this time, but her expression carried caution. The twins were sitting at a nearby table, coloring with bright crayons, humming to themselves. They didn't look up, too absorbed in their drawings to notice the tension between the adults in the room. Aaron approached the counter slowly, his voice low. "I just came to have coffee," he said. Sophia gave a short nod and poured him a cup, setting it in front of him without a word. He sat near the window, unsure if he was welcome but too desperate to be close to them to care. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The girls began to giggle about something, their laughter cutting through the silence. One of them turned suddenly and noticed him, her blue eyes bright with curiosity. She smiled and waved shyly. Aaron hesitated, then smiled back. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a tiny spark of light breaking through the years of regret that had darkened his life. From that day on, he started coming more often. At first, Sophia tolerated it in silence, though she watched him closely, ready to send him away if he crossed a line. He made no demands, never pushed. He would order coffee, sometimes lunch, and quietly help when something needed fixing. When he noticed a hinge loose on the door, he repaired it without being asked. When a delivery truck arrived and the driver struggled with boxes, Aaron stepped in to carry them inside. The other employees noticed, whispering among themselves, curious about the stranger in the expensive suit who seemed so out of place yet so determined to belong. The twins grew used to seeing him. They began to greet him when he arrived, sometimes showing him their drawings or telling him about their day at the daycare. They called him Mr. Aaron, their pronunciation slightly uneven, and every time they said it, he felt something twist inside his chest. It was strange and beautiful and painful all at once. One afternoon, when Sophia was cleaning the counter, she caught sight of him crouched beside the girls, helping them stack sugar packets into little towers. They were laughing, completely unaware of the world around them. Something in that sight made her stop. For years, she had imagined what it would be like if he had stayed, how different things might have been. She had convinced herself she no longer cared, that the anger had burned everything away. But watching him now, so gentle, so careful not to overstep, she realized that what remained wasn't hatred, it was fear. Fear of letting him close again and losing everything all over. One evening, as the sun dipped into the ocean and painted the cafe in golden light, Sophia stepped outside after closing and found Aaron standing near the entrance, tightening a loose bolt on the sign. She crossed her arms, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do that," she said. He turned to her, wiping his hands. "I know," he said quietly. "But it gives me a reason to stay a little longer." She looked at him for a moment, searching for arrogance or manipulation in his tone, but there was none. Just sincerity. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. He hesitated, glancing toward the cafe windows where the light flickered. "Because I can't change the past," he said. "But I can stop running from it. I can be useful. I can show up, even if it's too late." Her chest tightened at his words, though she forced herself to stay composed. "You think showing up now makes up for what you did?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at calm. "No," he said. "Nothing makes up for it. I know that. But I don't want to disappear again. Not if there's a chance to make even a small part of it right." She didn't reply. The sound of waves filled the space between them. For a long moment, they just stood there, two people tethered by pain and something that had once been love. Then she sighed, her voice quiet. "They don't know who you are. I want to keep it that way, for now." He nodded. "I understand." In the following weeks, his presence became almost routine. He helped fix a shelf one day, painted a cracked window frame the next, and even took over deliveries when the van broke down. He never spoke of the past or pushed her for forgiveness. He simply worked, smiled at the girls, and left quietly at the end of each day. Slowly, the town began to accept him too. Locals started greeting him by name, curious but kind, unaware of the story behind his eyes. Despite herself, Sophia began to soften. She noticed the small things, the way he crouched to talk to the twins at their level, the care he took to never overstep, the quiet gratitude that lived in his every action. One night, after closing, she found him outside again, fixing the light above the door. "You don't stop, do you?" she said with a tired smile. He laughed softly, lowering the wrench. "I guess I'm afraid that if I stop moving, I'll realize how much I've already lost." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You already know." His smile faded, but he didn't argue. That night, after he left, Sophia sat alone in the darkened cafe, thinking about everything that had changed since he walked back into their lives. It terrified her how quickly the girls had grown attached to him, how natural it felt to have him nearby. Part of her wanted to push him away before he could hurt them again, but another part, one she had buried years ago, wanted to believe that maybe people could change. When she finally went home, she checked on the twins as they slept. Their tiny faces were peaceful, framed by dark hair and those piercing blue eyes. She brushed a tear from her cheek and whispered to herself, "Don't let me be a fool again." At the same time, across town, Aaron sat alone in his car by the harbor, the ocean stretching endlessly before him. He thought of Sophia's voice, the way her walls seemed to tremble even when she tried to sound strong. He knew she didn't trust him, she had every reason not to, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't driven by pride or control. He didn't want to win her back through persuasion or charm. He wanted to earn his place quietly, through patience, through consistency, through every small act that proved he wasn't the same man who once walked away. He stayed until the sky turned from blue to black, until the stars began to shimmer above the water. And for the first time in years, he felt something almost like peace, fragile and fleeting but real. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was the beginning of it. And he promised himself that no matter how long it took, he would not leave again, not until Sophia looked at him and saw not the man who had abandoned her, but the one who had finally learned how to stay. The weeks began to blend together, each one a quiet rhythm of routine and restraint. Aaron came to the cafe almost every morning, never too early, never too eager, careful not to cross the invisible lines Sophia had drawn. He would order the same black coffee, sometimes a sandwich, sit near the window, and quietly observe the life that had once been his only in imagination. The twins would greet him with their shy smiles, and every time they did, he felt something inside him soften, a small piece of the coldness that had once defined him breaking apart. He was still an outsider in their world, but with every passing day, the distance seemed to shrink. The girls had accepted his presence long before their mother had. They showed him their drawings, asked him to taste their cookies, and once, when he sneezed, they both giggled uncontrollably, insisting he needed a pink napkin for healing. That moment, two tiny hands offering him a napkin with such seriousness, stayed in his mind longer than any business deal he'd ever made. Sophia watched these moments with mixed emotions. There were times she caught herself smiling without meaning to, especially when she saw how gentle Aaron was with them, how he listened with genuine interest to their endless stories about seashells and imaginary friends. But every smile was followed by guilt, because she didn't want to forget what he had done. She couldn't. Forgiveness wasn't a switch she could flip, it was something that demanded time, trust, and proof that he would not break them again. Late at night, when the cafe was empty and the twins were asleep, she would stand by the sink, washing cups while replaying the day in her head. Sometimes she would remember how cold his voice had sounded years ago when he said he wasn't sure the child was his, and it still hurt like an old scar that refused to fade. Yet when she thought of how he had stayed by the cafe door through a storm last week, just to make sure they got home safely, something in her heart began to waver. Then came the night that changed everything. It had been a long, busy day at the cafe, and the air carried the heaviness of an approaching storm. The twins had been unusually quiet all evening, and by closing time, Emma was flushed and shivering. Sophia touched her forehead and felt the unmistakable heat of a fever. Panic hit instantly, she didn't have anyone to leave the cafe with, and the nearest clinic was closed for the night. Aaron, who had just arrived to drop off some supplies for her, noticed the fear on her face before she even spoke. "She's sick," Sophia whispered, her voice shaking slightly. It came out of nowhere. Without hesitation, he took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I'm staying." That night stretched endlessly. The rain hammered against the windows, and thunder rolled over the sea. Aaron helped in every way he could, he brought towels, fetched water, and held the child when her small body trembled with chills. At one point, Sophia was sitting beside the bed, exhausted, her hands trembling as she tried to cool her daughter's forehead. Aaron knelt beside her, gently taking over, his movements calm and steady. "You should rest for a minute," he said softly. "You've been doing this alone for too long." She wanted to argue, to remind him that she didn't need him, but the truth was that she was too tired to speak. For the first time in years, she let someone else help her. Hours passed before the fever broke. When Emma finally drifted into sleep, Sophia exhaled with relief, her head resting against the edge of the bed. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her fear until that moment. Aaron stayed beside them, his arm resting lightly on the mattress, his eyes fixed on the little girl's peaceful face. At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell asleep right there, sitting on the floor. When morning came, Sophia woke to find him still there, his back against the wall, his jacket draped over the sleeping child. She watched him silently, her emotions tangled between gratitude and sorrow. He looked older, softer somehow, as though the years had finally caught up with him. When he finally stirred awake, she whispered, "You didn't have to stay." He rubbed his eyes and gave a tired smile. "I know. But I wanted to." There was no pride in his tone, no attempt to impress her, only quiet honesty. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then she simply nodded. "Thank you." It was the first time she had said those words to him since the day he left her. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. After that night, something changed between them. The tension that had always filled the air whenever they were alone began to soften. Sophia no longer flinched when he came close, she no longer looked at him as if waiting for him to disappear. She noticed small things he did, how he fixed the twins' broken toys without being asked, how he always remembered their favorite pastries, how he made sure to leave the cafe spotless before he left. It was as though he was quietly trying to rebuild something one act of kindness at a time. And though she never said it aloud, she began to rely on him more than she realized. One afternoon, when the twins were napping in the back room, Sophia brought him a cup of coffee without his asking. It was a small gesture, but when their fingers brushed as she handed it to him, the silence between them changed. He looked up at her, searching her face, but she quickly looked away. "Don't read into it," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It's just coffee." He smiled faintly, knowing it was more than that. The next few weeks were quiet but meaningful. Aaron began staying later in the evenings, helping her with the closing routine. Sometimes they talked about small things, the weather, the twins, plans for the cafe, but sometimes the silence between them was more honest than any conversation. One night, while sweeping the floor, Sophia said quietly, "They like you, you know." He paused mid-motion, his heart skipping. "I like them too," he said. She nodded, her back still turned to him. "Just remember," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "liking them isn't enough. If you want to be in their lives, you can't leave again." He set the broom down and walked closer, careful not to touch her. "I know," he said quietly. "I won't." After that, their lives began to intertwine in ways neither could have predicted. Aaron learned to cook simple meals for the girls, though he ruined more than he succeeded. Sophia laughed the first time he tried to flip pancakes and nearly set off the smoke alarm. It was the first time she had laughed like that in years, and when she caught his eyes afterward, she froze, realizing how natural it felt. Later that night, after he left, she found herself standing by the window, whispering to the quiet street outside, "Don't make me believe again if you're going to leave." In his hotel room that same night, Aaron sat at his desk, staring at a document his assistant had sent, an expansion proposal for a new overseas branch. Normally, he would have signed it immediately, but now, his mind was somewhere else entirely. He thought about the cafe, the twins, the sound of Sophia's laughter echoing in his memory. For the first time in his life, a business decision felt meaningless compared to a life he was just beginning to rebuild. He realized that success, the thing he had once worshipped, no longer mattered if it meant being alone. He closed his laptop, leaned back, and whispered to the empty room, "I'm not leaving again." The next morning, when he walked into the cafe, the twins ran to him, their hair messy and their hands sticky with jam. "Mr. Aaron," they shouted in unison, and he laughed, lifting them both at once. Sophia watched from behind the counter, her heart tightening at the sight. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in 3 years, the idea of it didn't scare her. For the first time, it felt like maybe the past didn't have to define them forever. By the time spring arrived, the air in the coastal town had begun to change, carrying a softness that made everything feel alive again. The cafe was busier than ever, filled with the smell of coffee and laughter, and in the middle of it all, Aaron had somehow become part of the daily rhythm. It happened quietly, almost naturally, as if time itself had decided to fold him into their lives. He never forced his presence, never demanded acknowledgement, he simply showed up every day, and little by little, the girls began to expect him. They waited for him to help with their drawings, to lift them up when they couldn't reach the cookie jar, or to tell stories about cities they had never seen. To them, he was a kind man who always listened, who fixed broken toys and made them feel important. To Sophia, he was something more complicated, a man she once loved, a man who had broken her heart, and now, strangely, the man who was helping her rebuild it without asking for anything in return. The mornings often began the same way. Sophia would unlock the cafe just as the sun rose over the water, and within an hour, Aaron would appear, holding 2 paper bags from the bakery. He'd hand them to the girls, pretending to whisper secrets about what was inside, even though it was always the same cinnamon rolls they adored. Sometimes he stayed in the background, helping customers or repairing small things that had gone unnoticed. Other times, he sat quietly at a table, reading while the girls played nearby. It was in these moments of calm that Sophia found herself watching him the most, studying how patient he was, how much care he put into even the smallest details. She told herself she was only observing, that she hadn't forgiven him, that she couldn't, but something inside her was already shifting in ways she couldn't control. Despite the steady rhythm of their new routine, the past still lingered like a shadow between them. There were moments when Sophia caught herself wanting to trust him again, only to pull back in fear. One afternoon, when the twins had gone to nap in the back room, she found herself sitting across from him at a table near the window. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Aaron broke it first, his voice quiet. "You don't have to keep thanking me for letting me stay around," he said. "I know I didn't earn it." Sophia looked at him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "You didn't," she agreed softly. "But you're trying. And that's more than I expected." He smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. "It's strange," he said. "I used to think the hardest thing in life was building something from nothing. Turns out, it's rebuilding what you destroyed." Her gaze dropped to the table. She wanted to tell him that he was right, that she still woke up some nights remembering the moment he told her he wasn't sure their child was his, that his words had buried her in a silence she thought she'd never escape. But when she looked up again, she saw the way his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup, and she realized that maybe he carried his own ghosts too. "You can't undo the past," she said quietly. "It's not something you can fix like a broken chair." He nodded. "I know. But maybe I can be better now. Maybe that's all that's left for people like me." That evening, a storm rolled in from the sea, sudden and violent. The rain fell in sheets against the cafe windows, the wind howling so loudly that the girls grew frightened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. In the darkness, the twins began to cry, clutching at Sophia's skirt. Without hesitation, Aaron knelt beside them, pulling out his phone to light up the room with a soft glow. He began telling them a story, his voice low and calm, weaving a tale about a lighthouse keeper who guided lost ships home during storms. The girls listened, their sobs quieting as his words filled the dark room. When the thunder shook the walls, he wrapped them both in his arms, holding them until their trembling stopped. Sophia stood nearby, watching, her heart caught between memory and the present. When the storm finally passed, the cafe was a mess of dripping water and scattered napkins. Aaron stayed to help clean up, refusing to leave even after she told him he should rest. They worked side by side in silence, their movements syncing naturally as if they had been doing this together for years. When the last table was wiped down, they stood facing each other, the faint glow of the emergency lantern casting soft shadows across their faces. Sophia's voice broke the silence. "You're good with them," she said, almost as if surprised by her own words. He shrugged lightly, his tone humble. "They make it easy." She hesitated, then added quietly, "They like you. Maybe too much." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Do you?" The question hung in the air like electricity. She froze, unprepared for the vulnerability in his voice. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain outside and the rhythmic drip of water from the awning. Finally, she shook her head slowly, her voice soft but unsteady. "It's not that simple." He took a step closer but stopped himself before crossing the invisible line she had drawn between them. "I know," he said. "Nothing about this is simple. But I don't expect anything from you, Sophia. I just want to be where they are. Where you are." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. "And if I can't forgive you?" she asked. "Then I'll keep showing up," he said. "Until you believe I mean it." The word settled into her like a seed, small but impossible to ignore. That night, after he left, she found herself lying awake, listening to the sound of the sea outside her window. She thought about everything she had lost, but also about what she had found, how the girls laughed differently when he was around, how the house felt warmer somehow, how the silence between her and him no longer felt like a wound but something healing slowly, carefully. For years she had carried anger like armor, convincing herself it kept her safe. Now, she wasn't so sure. In the days that followed, she began to notice the way the twins looked at Aaron, as if he were something solid in their small, uncertain world. He never overstepped, never tried to claim a role that wasn't his, but his presence filled a space that had been empty for too long. One afternoon, Sophia overheard Emma telling her sister, "Mr. Aaron doesn't talk loud like other grown-ups. He listens." That simple observation made her eyes sting with tears. Still, she couldn't let herself trust completely. One evening, as they closed the cafe, she finally asked the question that had haunted her for months. "Why now?" He looked up from wiping the counter, puzzled. "What do you mean?" She crossed her arms, her voice firm but trembling. "Why come back after 3 years? Why now, when I've already built something without you?" He took a long breath before answering. "Because I spent 3 years pretending I didn't care. I told myself you were better off, that it was cleaner to stay away. But I was wrong. Every day since I left, I've felt like a ghost in my own life. And when I saw them, our girls, I realized that all my success meant nothing. I wanted to come home, but I didn't know how." Sophia looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with tears she didn't want him to see. "Home isn't a place you get to walk back into just because you regret leaving," she said quietly. "You have to rebuild it." He nodded, his voice barely audible. "Then let me start with one brick." She turned away, unable to respond, but deep down, she knew the wall between them was beginning to crack. Later that night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Sophia stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and smelled of salt. She looked out at the ocean and saw the faint glow of a lighthouse in the distance, steady and unbroken. For some reason, it made her think of him, of the way he had held their daughters during the storm, of how his voice had steadied them. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but she couldn't deny what she felt anymore. He was becoming part of their world, not through grand gestures or apologies, but through quiet consistency. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to whisper the thought she had been too afraid to believe: maybe people could change after all. The weeks that followed were slow but transformative, filled with quiet moments that neither of them dared to define. The cafe had become a small world of its own, a place where routine stitched the fragments of their lives together one day at a time. Aaron continued to arrive every morning, his presence now expected rather than surprising. He no longer felt like an outsider peering into a life that wasn't his. Instead, he had become part of its rhythm, moving naturally within it. The twins had grown bolder around him, climbing into his lap to show him their scribbled drawings or tugging on his sleeve to play. Sometimes, when Sophia was too busy to watch, he would lift them high into the air, their laughter echoing through the cafe like music. Every sound of their joy hit something deep inside him, a mix of wonder and shame, because it reminded him of how much he had missed, how many firsts had passed without him there. Sophia noticed the way he looked at them, how his eyes softened when they smiled, and though she tried to tell herself not to care, she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. There was something undeniably genuine about the way Aaron loved the girls, even though they didn't yet know who he really was. Still, she fought her feelings. She told herself that forgiveness was dangerous, that people like him didn't change completely, that one day he might leave again and she'd have to explain it to the children. Yet each time she saw him wiping flour from his shirt after helping the twins bake cookies, or kneeling on the floor to fix a broken toy, her defenses weakened just a little more. Then, one quiet Sunday afternoon, everything shifted. The cafe was closed, and Sophia had taken the girls to the park nearby. The air was warm and filled with the smell of freshly cut grass, the ocean breeze gentle on her skin. Aaron appeared unexpectedly, carrying a small box of pastries from the bakery. The twins ran to him immediately, their joy unrestrained. "Mr. Aaron! You came," they shouted, and he laughed, crouching down to their level. "Of course I did," he said. "I promised I'd bring treats, didn't I?" As they ate and played on the swings, Sophia stood watching from a distance, her arms crossed loosely. He caught her gaze once, and something passed between them, a quiet understanding that words could not express. When the girls grew tired and ran toward the sandbox, Aaron walked over to Sophia. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the twins together. "You've done an incredible job with them," he said softly. "They're bright, kind, full of life." She gave a small, tired smile. "They're all I have," she said. "I had to be both parents." He nodded slowly, the guilt in his eyes unmistakable. "I should have been there," he said. "Every day that I wasn't." She turned her head toward him, her tone sharp but trembling. "Then why weren't you, Aaron? You looked me in the eyes and said you weren't sure if they were yours. Do you know what that did to me?" His voice broke slightly. "I was a coward. I thought I was protecting myself from disappointment. I didn't understand what I was losing until it was already gone." Sophia looked at him for a long time, her anger softening under the weight of his words. "You can't undo it," she said. "No matter how sorry you are." He took a step closer, his tone quiet. "I know. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." She didn't answer. The twins called to her from the swings, and she walked away, leaving him standing there in the sunlight, his heart heavy but determined. That evening, the weather turned unexpectedly. The sky darkened, and the wind picked up. Sophia had just put the girls to bed when there was a loud knock on the door. She opened it to find Aaron, drenched from the rain, his face pale. "There's a landslide blocking the road by the cafe," he said. "I came to make sure you were safe." She blinked in shock. "You drove here in this?" He shrugged, rainwater dripping from his hair. "I wasn't going to sit and wonder if you were okay." For a moment, neither spoke, the tension between them thick and electric. Then she stepped aside and let him in. Inside, the small house felt warmer, cozier than he had imagined. He stood awkwardly by the doorway, his clothes soaked through. Sophia handed him a towel, shaking her head. "You're impossible," she murmured, though there was a hint of a smile in her voice. He dried his hair, laughing softly. "Maybe," he said. "But I'm here." The sound of thunder made the twins cry out from the bedroom, and Sophia rushed to them. Aaron followed quietly, standing in the doorway as he watched her comfort them. Without thinking, he stepped closer, sitting beside them on the bed. One of the girls reached out, her small hand resting on his. "Stay," she whispered. He froze for a second, then nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." They all sat there together as the storm raged outside, the thunder rolling like distant drums. Aaron told them another story, this one about a man who lost his way in a storm and found his heart again by following the sound of laughter. The girls listened intently, their eyelids heavy with sleep, and soon they drifted off, their heads resting against his arm. Sophia watched him, her chest tightening with a mix of emotion she couldn't name. She saw how tenderly he looked at them, how careful his every movement was, as if afraid that breathing too loudly might wake them. When she finally met his gaze, he whispered, "They deserve to know the truth, don't they?" Her breath caught. For months, she had avoided that question, afraid of what it might mean. "I don't know if they're ready," she said quietly. "I don't even know if I'm ready." He nodded slowly, his expression full of understanding. "Whenever you are," he said. "I'll be here." When the storm ended and he finally stood to leave, Sophia walked him to the door. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of earth and salt. He hesitated before stepping outside. "You don't have to forgive me," he said. "But thank you for letting me be part of their world." She looked at him, her voice soft but steady. "You already are, Aaron. Whether I like it or not." After he left, she stood by the window, watching his car disappear into the fog. She realized then that she no longer felt the sharp sting of anger when she thought of him. What she felt instead was something gentler, something she hadn't let herself feel in years: hope. It terrified her, but it also warmed her in a way nothing else had since the day he walked away. The next morning, when he came to the cafe, Sophia didn't greet him with her usual guarded tone. Instead, she handed him a cup of coffee before he could order and said quietly, "Sit. We need to talk." He froze, unsure of what was coming. "They deserve to know who you are," she continued. "But if we tell them, I need to know you're not going anywhere again." He met her eyes and answered without hesitation. "I'm not." It wasn't forgiveness yet, and it wasn't love. It was something in between, fragile, uncertain, but real. As they sat across from each other in the morning light, the sound of the twins' laughter filling the room, Sophia finally allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't built on fear. Maybe it would take years to fully trust him again, but for the first time since he left her, she believed he might actually stay. The morning they told the girls the truth was quiet and strangely calm, the kind of morning when the world seemed to hold its breath. The cafe had not yet opened, and sunlight streamed through the large front windows, painting warm gold patterns across the wooden floor. Sophia had spent the night pacing, her mind torn between fear and resolve. She had dreamed of this conversation 1,000 times, each version ending differently, but none of them felt real until now. Aaron had offered to let her do it alone, but she had shaken her head. This was something they had to do together. For once, she didn't want to face the past without him beside her. The twins were sitting at a small table, eating pancakes and giggling over a spilled drop of syrup when Sophia called them over. They came running, their small feet thudding against the floor, their faces bright and sticky with sugar. Aaron knelt down so he could look at them at eye level. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it in his ears. He had stood in boardrooms before hundreds of people, made decisions that moved millions of dollars, but this moment terrified him more than anything in his life. Sophia took a deep breath, her voice gentle but steady. "Girls," she said softly,